This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 36 of season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, September 9th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mrs. C.C.P. Hiller, Hiller, of Everett, was a guest for a few days last week at the Mrs. Atwood. The CCCP stood for Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, who was one of our founding fathers from South Carolina, served as a military officer and also served in the 1787 Constitutional Convention and later as a United States minister to France. Reverend C.C.P. Hiller actually served both the Methodist Church in town and the Union Congregational Church at the same time in the early 1900s. Miss Annie Barnard and Miss Florence Barnard of Brookline have been recent visitors at Willis Hildreth's. Workmen are busy building a bay window on the southwest side of Walter Merritt's house. Next section is the Pomona Grange section. The day for the meeting of the North Middlesex Pomona Grange on Friday, September 1st, came out clear and beautiful after the week of rain. This Pomona, consisting of members of Billerica, Dracut, Tewksbury, Tingsboro, Chelmsford, North Reading, and Wilmington, has for some years had a central place of meeting in Lowell, but recently voted to hold its sessions with the different granges with the view of being beneficial to the local grange. Westford came first in this new schedule, and there was a good representation at Friday's meeting. After the opening of the session and reports from different granges, the subject for the morning's discussion was taken up, namely, quote, "What has proved the most profitable crop on the farm for you?" End quote. This was well sustained and interesting. Among those who gave experiences were Mrs. Sherburne of Tingsboro, Samuel L. Taylor of Westford, G.W. Trull of Tewksbury, DeLacy Corkum of Billerica, Mr. Howe and Mr. Milliken of Dracut, and Mr. Davis of North Reading. Dairying, poultry keeping, and fruit and vegetable raising all had their exponents. While perhaps much that was brought out might not be strictly new, the main thought that what the individual was best adapted for, plus determination, ability, energy, and good old-fashioned hustle, that's in quotes, was well emphasized. The cost of labor and the cleaning up of some of the sordid conditions of slum city life, as well as our country barn, were subtopics well treated. The second subject for the morning, quote, resolved that the automobile is a benefit rather than a determinant to the farmer, end quote, claimed the remainder of the morning session with sentiment toward the affirmative. Remember, this was in 1911, in the early days of automobiling, but that certainly seemed like it would be the right answer. An excellent dinner was served at noon by the entertaining Grange in charge of Mrs. Arthur Blodgett, after which many of the visitors took the opportunity to inspect our pretty village. The afternoon session was open to the public and was reinforced by a number from outside. The address of welcome was given by Samuel L. Taylor with characteristic cordial wit and wisdom. J.F. Anthony, master of the Pomona, responded and was followed with a skillful piano duet by Mrs. Cyril Blaney and Miss Lillian Sutherland. Mrs. W.A. Sherburne, lecturer and pro tem of Tingsboro, gave dialect selections, after which a trio of maidens gave a charming feature as follows. Song, Miss Lillian Sutherland, violin obligato, Miss Evelyn Hamlin, accompaniment, Miss Hazel Hartford. There was also singing by Miss Rachel Wall, Miss Ruth Furbush, accompanist, and piano solo by Miss Grace Robinson. The speaker of the afternoon was J.C. Warren of the State Board of Education. He endorsed the introduction of industrial education into the school curriculum and gave some account of its practical workings in the little town of Peru in the western part of the state. Cooking, agriculture, and storekeeping were the branches told of. The meeting closed at 4:30. There were guests present from Groton, Littleton, Pepperell, and Nashua. The next meeting will be held with the North Reading Grange the first Friday in October. Next, we have a letter to the editor. In this paper of August 19th, there appeared a series of questions by Daniel Daly, who is a stranger to the writer of this article, that is, Sam Taylor. The writer is equally desirous in the same direction, and we only differ as to facts and the best method of procedure. Now, to answer these questions properly would require the whole space of this paper, for which I have not time to occupy, and someone suggests not ability. Thank you. I was going to mention that later. The first question reads, does the system of capitalism under which we are now living make it impossible for man to live an honest, moral, upright life and do unto others as he would be done by? End quote. The writer can only emphasize what was expressed in a previous article, that the doors are wide open in all directions for intellectual and moral improvement. The present system has opened these doors. These paths have never been crowded. Scarcely anyone has fully utilized opportunities. Everyone should have an opportunity for moral and intellectual improvement. Opportunity is everywhere. Walk in. But if you prefer cheaper goods and less effort, you will only illustrate the truth of old. Give us of your oil, for our lamps have gone out. That's from Matthew chapter 25, verse 8b. Don't lay it onto, quote, the system, end quote. And when it comes to living an honest life, if only poor people were dishonest, it might look a little shady for the system, but the wealth is in it much more than poverty. More only in the source of the extent of damages, not more as relates to numbers. If a sharp man cheats you in trade, can he excuse himself by saying the system, in quotes? The system, in quotes, that is. Would he suddenly become honest under, quote, socialism, end quote? Two neighbors living closely on opposite sides of the road are not on speaking terms and have not been for years. Would socialism make them speak? It is wholly a question of the overthrow by the law of love. Both our personal qualities and government or, quote, systems, end quote, do not prevent action by selfishness or love. Representative James N. Carey said at the meeting at Westford, quote, socialism will remove all poverty and evil, end quote. If that is true, then the converse of it must also be true, that the present system, quote, system, is responsible for poverty and evil. Now, to set at naught personal responsibility for conduct and substitute the responsibility of the, quote, system under which we live is entering dangerously deep waters, and the ship of life in which we are all sailing will have to have added, quote, lighthouses to keep from shipwreck on the dangerous rocks of personal responsibility, end quote. The second question reads, quote, if the system of capitalism were destroyed, would not the system of cooperation, parentheses, socialism, naturally follow? If not, what would follow, end quote. The present system of capitalism is the system of individual capacity. A large capacity gives us a J.P. Morgan. The little fellow couldn't be a Morgan, though the doors were wide open and his friends pushed him into the large arena. Were we all equal in capacity and started with equal capital and make equal foolish and wise commands, then at the end of life, the credit and debt of everyone would be alike. The nature will not countenance any two being alike, hence results are not alike. Two persons start in the same business with equal capital. Both have an equal amount of domestic misfortune at the end of a term of years. One retires with a small fortune, the other settles in bankruptcy. These two opposite results is the measurement of the difference in individual capacity. Should we change to socialism, you would not have changed the law of individual capacity, and inequalities would still be a troublesome quantity to settle with. Cooperation differs from socialism in that it selects its company with reference to individual capacity for the work to be performed and weeds out all else. Socialism attempts to make uncongenial, ill-fitting personalities harmonize. What would follow the present system might depend on how the present system was got rid of. And it's signed by S.L. Taylor, Samuel L. Taylor. And that's his bit of philosophy for this week. The next section is the About Town section. Henry B. Reed has been listed on the sick list, but now he is listed on the well list. John A. Taylor starts on Tuesday for North Dakota, where he taught at the University of North Dakota for a number of years. The Middlesex North Agricultural Society will hold its annual fair at Billerica on September 14th and 15th in connection with Billerica Grange. The funeral of Mrs. Igerson took place from the home of her son-in-law, George E. Prescott, Saturday afternoon of last week. Reverend David Wallace conducted the services, burial in Fairview Cemetery under the direction of David L. Grieg, undertaker. Next section is the Forge Village section. Cameron School reopened on Tuesday morning. There has been no change in the teaching staff. The fall term of the Sunday school will begin tomorrow afternoon at St. Andrew's Mission at 3 o'clock. Mr. and Mrs. William Burnett visited in Worcester during the week. Robert McCardle and William Franz, F-R-A-N-Z, of Manchester, New Hampshire, spent several days during the week as guests of Mr. and Mrs. John Burnett. The gentlemen enjoyed a most pleasant fishing trip and returned home with a long string of fish, among which were 3 prize pickerel. Mr. George Jackson is visiting with relatives in Maine. 2 airships, by that they mean airplanes, passed over the village on Monday afternoon, which attracted great attention. More on this in a moment. Mr. and Mrs. John McNiff entertained at their home on the holiday Mr. and Mrs. Fred Emmett and family and William Mitchell of Lawrence. James Walsh of Lawrence was the guest of Miss Alice Walsh over Sunday. Mr. and Mrs. Ephraim Vickers of Providence, Rhode Island, visited relatives here on Labor Day. William D. Rohn spent last week visiting his aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Tyler of Worcester. Alvin S. Bennett, Mrs. Mary Drake, and Mrs. Lucretia Reed attended the Bennett family reunion held at the home of John Bennett of Worcester on Labor Day. Miss Gladys Daly has recently been entertaining Miss Florence Lundigan of Leominster. J.B. Carmichael, Russell Furbush, James Sargent, and friends spent a few days last week enjoying camp life at Beaver Cottage. Mrs. Lottie and Mildred Parrott have returned from their summer vacation spent in North Adams. Miss Agnes Milligan and little brother, Master Frank Milligan of East Boston, spent last week visiting at the home of Mr. and Mrs. James May. Mrs. Annie and Mary Leclerc spent the holiday as guests of their sister, Mrs. John Paquette of Nashua, New Hampshire. Miss Luella Prescott has returned to her duties as teacher in the public school in Andover. John Bannister, Bert Comey, and B. Griffiths spent the holiday at the Nashua Fair. The next item is from Groton, and it's called the Aeroplanes. And they spell that aeroplanes, Aeroplanes, with an umlaut over the E. And by that they mean airplanes. And there's also a similar section in Ayer that goes into a little more detail. So I'll just read that one instead of duplicating the readings. The one in Ayer is entitled, the section is entitled Labor Day. Labor Day was quietly observed here. The only unusual event was the passing of the airships. These are not blimps, but rather airplanes, as mentioned a minute ago. By the passage of airships over town in the much heralded tri-state flight, the prizes for which were given by the Boston Globe through its editor, Colonel Charles H. Taylor. By previous arrangement with the manager of the telephone company, J.J. Berry, and chief engineer, P.H. Hooley, of the local fire department, the fire alarm was sounded when the first aviator left Nashua. In anticipation of witnessing the novel sight, large numbers of people gathered on the higher elevations. Just a little bit of an explanation. 2 airplanes were the only 2 entries remaining in the tri-state race held on Labor Day, September 4th, as part of the second Harvard-Boston Aero Meet. The race started at Squantum Airfield in Quincy, then thence to Nashua, New Hampshire, and then Worcester, Mass, and Providence, Rhode Island, before returning to Squantum in Quincy. Participants were required to land at each of these sites along the 174-mile course, and at towns along the way, throngs gathered on hills to look for the planes, as is being described here. At precisely 1:17 o'clock, the 2 blasts of the fire alarm notified the expectant crowds that the first airship was headed this way on its journey to Worcester. 16 minutes later, a machine was sighted in the east and was so far away that it was hardly visible without the aid of field glasses. It remained in sight for nearly a half an hour. About this time, another machine was seen in the same direction, and it was thought it was the first one, which had lost its course and was going higher in order to escape the high currents in the upper air. This proved to be incorrect, as there were 2 separate machines. The first airship was the Blériot and Queen monoplane, operated by Earl Ovington, O-V-I-N-G-T-O-N, which was ahead of the second, which was a Burgess Wright biplane. By the way, that was the first licensed production aircraft in the United States, operated by Lieutenant T. DeWitt Milling, who was delayed on the route from Squantum to Nashua. After waiting some time to get a better view of the flying machines, some of the crowd left, but those who waited were well repaid for doing so, as Lieutenant Milling's ship came along on its way to Worcester and sailed over town at an altitude that it could be plainly seen and the noise of the motor heard. Of the 4 entrants, the above-named finished the flight, Harry Atwood in a Burgess Wright aircraft and Arthur B. Stone in a Queen monoplane, being obliged to stop at Medford. There were objections by several who proposed to enter the contest because they considered the route between Nashua and Worcester too dangerous and wished to have this part of the journey changed. I suspect this was because that route was heavily wooded, and there were many trees and too few safe emergency landing sites. A hearing was given them by the committee in charge last Saturday, and their objections heard when the committee announced that the original plans would be adhered to. A final inspection of the route was made last Sunday in automobiles, and as a result, Claude Graham White and Thomas O.M. Sopwith, the English aviators, refused to enter. Sopwith, if that name sounds familiar, it's because he later built the famed World War I Sopwith Camel biplane fighter that was made famous by Snoopy in the Peanuts cartoons. He turned the roof of his doghouse into a Sopwith Camel biplane. That's the news in Westford for the week ending September 9th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historic Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.